something about having another man that pushes you, that pulls you, that drives you, that causes you to level up and step up into the man you're capable of becoming. So I joined when I was 17, still in high school, joined the National Guard. Didn't really have any plans on what I wanted to do. Wanted to be a warrior and a contributor to society. I had to take responsibility for myself and for other people I didn't even know. And that translates perfectly into running a business, leading a family, coaching a sports team.
And so you started Order of Man. Can you explain why that became so evident to you as important?
You know, I think about what life would have been like had I had a father. And I think what it comes down to is a level of confidence. Now, some people will say, do you wish you had a father in my life? I would say no, because I don't think I'd be the same man that I am today if I didn't have that. I don't think I would have gone on a quest to solve my own problems as a man, which in turn has literally helped millions of people across the planet. And we don't think about how fragile life is. And we don't think about how powerful we are. I mean, we really are. You know, I don't want to be mediocre. I don't want to be average. I don't want people to not know who I am. A lot of people say that's narcissistic or selfish. Maybe it is. But I'm driven to be significant, and I don't want to be insignificant.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... What does it mean to be a man? This is a common question we're hearing about today, and we also hear a term called toxic masculinity quite a lot. What does that mean? Is that loaded in itself? Well, these are some of the things I sat down and spoke to Ryan Mickler about, and he has a podcast and a movement called the Order of Man. And he used to be someone who was unhappy in life and unhappy in his marriage until he discovered that he had to go into his masculinity. And he says the job of a man is to protect, to provide, and to preside. And by doing those things, you can empower everyone around you. And it was great to sit down and talk to him about these concepts like the patriarchy that a lot of people consider to be something bad. I think it's important that we embrace the good parts of masculinity and that us men be proud of being men, and we make sure that we actually show up and be real men every single day and not be boys in the disguise of men. This is powerful stuff. It might offend some, but I think it's important to have these discussions, and I'm curious what you think as you enjoy this episode with Ryan Mickler. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Ryan Mickler, the American author, broadcaster, combat veteran, and founder of the Order of Man. Your mission is to help men grow fully into their roles as protectors and providers for themselves, their families, and their communities. Your book, Sovereignty, calls on men to fulfill their masculine potential with your 13 sovereign virtues. And your Order of Man podcast features leading influencers like Jocko Willink, Ryan Holiday, David Goggins, and me too.
Yes.
Ryan, welcome to London.
Glad to be here.
Dude, man, great to have you here, man.
It's been a long, we were talking before we started recording. I think I was introduced to London Real probably about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the studio. And so to be sitting in here and having a conversation with you is really cool.
It's
really
super
humbling.
cool, man. And you had me on your show maybe 2 years ago, right? Or
I don't know if it was even that long ago. It was,
18 months
Yeah,
maybe.
somewhere in there, but yeah.
And you know, it's interesting because I know we both teach broadcasting to students, and I get a lot of people that reach out to me, and I say a lot of no's. But when you reached out to me, I looked at what you did and I saw your background and I said, yes, And that's why I always tell my podcasting students, if you have a mission and intention and a real purpose, it doesn't necessarily matter how many views you have or all this other stuff. And I didn't check your views. I just looked at you and I was like, this is a guy who's serious about what he's doing. He's obviously been doing it for a while. I looked at your background, your service background, and like I said, you had a mission and intention, and that's why I said yes. And
Well,
so
I
always
think
tell my students that too. You know?
Yeah, well, I think that, but I also think somebody who's willing to make a stand for something. I was talking with my wife as we were walking around London. You know, a lot of the things I share aren't always the most popular things.
Yeah.
But that's important. And you know you're hitting stride when you hear a bunch of people who say, thank you for saying what I've been thinking for 20 years. Thank you for having the courage to make that stand.
Well, they say great art divides.
Yes.
And one of my guests, Grant Cardone, says criticism is a sign of success. You know, and if you're not saying anything, then you're always going to have this lukewarm reaction for everybody out there. But if you stand for something, you're going to get people that disagree, but you're also going to be you, and you're going to find a tribe of people that do agree, depending on what you have to say. And I guess you found that.
I think I've found it. I don't even like saying found it as much as maybe created it, discovered it, something a little bit more assertive, I think, than found it.
Yeah.
Because it's always there.
It's always there.
Right? But I feel like if you say you found it, you tripped over it. But I've been
connected to it and then articulated it and then refined it, and now you're about it.
And continuing to redefine and articulate it and massage it, and really what resonates with me as I evolve as a man, and I have, a lot of my thoughts have not necessarily changed, but crystallized. And then knowing what resonates with the guys who want to be inspired and want to be led and who want to do the leading. It's important for me to hear their voice as well.
Yeah. So I don't know where to start off, but I wanted to start with a quote from you, and it goes like this: "We've gone away from being strong, rugged, independent, and tough to a collection of wimpy, dependent whiners. Something has got to be done." Now that's one of the things I just jumped in with there. But you know, we hear this term toxic masculinity thrown around a lot these days. And like, I don't know where to start with you, but with that quote and that term, maybe we can get into some of the things that you talk about.
Yeah.
I haven't really had a proper discussion about that here. I've spoken with Dr. Jordan Peterson. I spoke to Elliot Hulse. So we touched on a lot of issues. But how do you start this conversation with people, especially people that maybe haven't been following you or that don't know that there's this conversation out there?
Right.
How do you start talking about some things that matter to you and kind of your purpose and your mission and order of man?
I actually talk a lot about myself 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was more the latter of that quote.
Okay.
I was that guy.
Who were you?
I was lost. I really was. I was lost. I grew up without a permanent father figure in my life. I had a couple of stepfathers come into my life who weren't great examples looking back on what it meant to be a man. You know, I think about my childhood, and I remember my friends, they would go on hunts with their dads, and they'd be playing catch in the yard with their dads, and I didn't have that. But I didn't feel bad as a kid. I really didn't, because you don't know, right? You don't know, you don't have anything to compare it to. So my life was just my life. It wasn't like I felt like I was missing out. I did a lot, and I'm sure we'll get into some of these things that I've been able to do, but I got married, and I was lost as a husband. You know, I didn't know how a man showed up for his family.
How did you know that?
Because the results weren't there. You know, there wasn't love. There wasn't a whole lot of respect in our relationship. My wife's here, you know, right now. There wasn't a whole lot of respect mutually between her and I. At times I feel bad about even saying this, but I didn't really even want to, you know, be at home. You know, I wanted to be out pursuing work and doing the things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. I had a 1-year-old son at the time, and I didn't know how to father him. And I felt like, you know, at times more of a nuisance. I always loved him, but more of a nuisance really than my son. I mean, I think about who I was then. I feel bad about even saying it. There was a time where my wife and I got into an argument. We were supposed to go on a trip, and we couldn't. It started snowing or something, and we came home and we got into an argument. And long story short, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I don't even want to be married to you anymore." And she said, "I don't either." And the next morning, she left. And so her and I went through this separation, and I really struggled. I remember sitting in my 1-year-old son's room at the time, empty, crib, couple pictures on the wall of him, looking at the picture of him crying, saying, I'm going to find a way to get you back in my life. And through a lot of work and a lot of conversation and a lot of self-discovery on my own part, and you know what? She would say the same thing about herself. So I don't want to excuse any of the things that she had to work on, because a lot of guys will say that, well, it takes two to tango. Yes, it does. But I could only work on myself. I couldn't do anything about her. And that's actually what I tried to do, is I tried to control her, manipulate her. If I thought, if only I could get her to change, then everything would be fine. You know, if she was appreciative and supportive and did the things that a quote unquote good wife should do, then we wouldn't have these issues. And it wasn't until I actually came to the conclusion, I remember the road I was on, the cross street I was on, where I thought to myself, this marriage is over. And simultaneously, I remember thinking, well, if this marriage is over, then I just want to become the best catch for the next woman to come into my life. And that's where things started clicking for me, is I began to work on myself. I began to fix the business that I had, which was a financial planning firm. You and I have talked about that a little bit in the past. I got back into shape, started to get the finances in order, started to focus on me, which a lot of guys don't do. You know, I look at guys driving down the road to work and I assume they're miserable, because I can see in their eyes they're miserable. They're driving to a job that they hate, to sit in a cubicle or box for 8, 9, 10 hours a day, to get home, you know, to feel annoyed or put out that they have to do anything with their wife or kids, eat dinner, maybe watch some TV for a couple hours, go to bed, sleep an insufficient amount of sleep, and then get up and do the same thing over and over and over again. And these guys are just running through this cycle. I know what it feels like, because that was me. And when I started to work on myself, I was able to remedy and fix a lot of that. I feel like over the past, it's been almost 11 years now since my wife and I went through our separation. I'm a significantly better husband, significantly better father, but that all stemmed from learning to take care of myself.
Okay. But this is a book about masculinity, not a self-help book.
True.
So how did that become part of your journey, where you were like, okay, I'm finding these things to be either resonating with you or making you a better person?
Well, I feel like it's a man's job to be the protector, to be the provider, and not just financially, there's other provisions as well, and the presider, the leader. And I feel like we've stepped away from a lot of that as men. I feel like we as a society have generally said that men aren't needed, that they aren't respected. Most men are, it seems like if you watch TV, are mocked and ridiculed, and the dad and the man is looked at the stupid buffoon who trips over everything and can't do anything right. A lot of that is actually manifest in real life as well. You look around and you see these guys who can't lead their families, can't lead their communities, can't even lead themselves. And I found that for me, as I stepped into what I would call masculine strength and learned how to be a more effective man, I became fulfilled. And that's the problem, is the further that men move away from what it means to be a man and move away from genuine masculinity in the name of fairness, in the name of equality, in the name of just sit down, shut up, do what you're supposed to do, the less fulfilled, the less satisfied, the less productive, the less effective, and more miserable that they are. And so I feel like with the work that we do is a call to step away from mediocrity, a call to step away from the trends of society, which is a more effeminate society, into and reclaiming and restoring what it means to be a man.
Why is the trend to be more effeminate? Why is that? Have you thought about it? You must have.
I've thought a lot about it.
Because it's not necessarily the Illuminati planning this, the grand scheme. It's not like all the women have got together and say, we're going to do this. It's happening. And
Yes.
It's probably been happening for 100 years, maybe.
Right.
Have you thought about why?
Well, I think let's start with when it started happening. And I believe it started to happen near and during the Industrial Revolution. Because what was happening prior to the Industrial Revolution is the men of the house were out tilling the fields, working the land, teaching their boys specifically, who are out tilling the fields, working the land with their dads, what it meant to be a man. Now we come into the Industrial Revolution, and out of necessity, men are shipped away to factories, right? They're shipped away to factories to go do the work. Now they're no longer at home. So where are the boys? Where are the girls? They're with mom, right? And so now little Timmy and little Tommy are with mom, and she is raising them by herself. The guys are gone. They're nowhere to be found. They come home at night, pat the little kids on the head, and they go to bed, and then they don't see them again till the next night. So now little Timmy and Tommy are raised by mom. Now what happens? Well, mom starts, during the feminist movement, starts to enter the workforce. So now mom's out of the picture. So what do we do with little Timmy and little Tommy? Well, we got to ship them somewhere too. So we shipped them to schools. So we introduced them to the school system. You look at the school system, who's teaching Timmy and Tommy? Women. And there's nothing, I want to say there's nothing wrong with women. There's nothing wrong with boys learning from women. But if they don't have the male presence, that masculine energy, what ends up happening to little Timmy and little Tommy is they have all this masculinity coursing through their veins, and they don't know how to channel it and how to power it. And what happens is they become either submissive, because that's what they're quote unquote supposed to do, right? Sit down, shut up, color within the lines. If you get out of line, we're going to medicate you because we can't have you acting that way. Or they become destructive. And what do? They go up and they shoot a school, right? Or they go and create some other sort of problem because there's no positive male influence teaching them to harness that power. I found a lot of that through sports. I remember when I must have been 12 or 13. It was before I moved to Southern Utah. I moved to a very small town in Southern Utah. Prior to that, I lived in a big city in Anaheim in Southern California. And my mom raised me and my sister predominantly on her own. But the thing that my mom always knew, and I love and admire and respect about her, more than probably about anything for this, is that she always knew she needed to get me around other men. She knew there was a limit on what she could do in raising me from a boy to a man, and that there's something that she had to step away from and allow me to go out into the world and do myself.
Do you think most single mothers would agree with that?
They do, but they don't do it.
Right. But you think most would actually say,
100%.
Especially if you got boys bouncing off the walls, 8, 9, 10 years old.
100%.
You know, I don't know if you remember the movie Boys in the Hood.
Yes.
Great movie, but it all starts with his mother saying, I can't teach you how to be a man. And she sends her son to live with,
right,
with Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah, with his dad.
Yeah, and that's where...
Who was rough, right?
Yeah,
a little rougher.
Who was masculine energy,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And even though his mom was actually... She actually had a bit of masculine energy, and she was trying to lay down the law, but she was still frustrated because she couldn't do what I guess the dad could do.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's a little bit of a case study.
It's exactly right. And I think, and the reason I say this is, maybe it's anecdotal when you ask if most women would do that. I think it's anecdotal. The reason I say that is because I get quite a few messages from women saying the same thing you're saying.
Okay. Hey,
I've got my son, he's 10, 11, 12 years old, and dad's not here, and I actually listen to your podcast because I listen for him. And I don't know what to do. What should I do? And my answer is get him involved in competitive sports.
Okay.
All male competitive sports. And people will say, well, what's wrong with girls being there? Because it changes. I can watch my 11 and my 8-year-old little boys posture when a cute little girl walks in, and I can see it on their football teams. I can see it in their demeanor and the way they act. It changes, and there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's healthy. But there needs to be an environment where there isn't women around. And this is why I was so frustrated with the Boy Scouts, their continual progress and movement towards allowing women into Scouts.
Which is now a done deal.
It's a done deal.
It's changed the name now, right?
It's
not Boy Scouts
Scouts.
anymore?
I think technically it's BSA-Scouts.
Okay, Boy Scouts of America. Oh,
But you can't say Boy Scouts of America, just BSA.
Okay.
Because it can't just be Boy Scouts.
What's going on with your country there, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
No,
well,
look,
it's your
now,
country too.
It is.
Half your country
Thank
too.
you, it is. And my boys are American, half Bulgarian, and half British. But look, you make a point, and I've been around a bunch of guys, and the dynamic is different as soon as a woman is in the room. And I don't mean this to be sexist. And again, you can have guys that would be like, all right, I'm not posturing, and I'm already married, and I don't care. But it still changes the dynamic.
I mean,
somehow.
get real. Yeah, of course.
And when I went to MIT, I lived in a fraternity house with 50 guys from 18 to 22.
Mm-hmm.
And they were some of the best times of my life. And I learned so much about, I used to say, Ryan, about life, but it was about being a man. Because like within 6 months, I did something wrong. I said something out of line, and one of the guys pulled me aside and said, don't you ever do that again. And that was one of the first like guy talks I had. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, this is how you behave as a man. You don't gossip, you don't do this stuff. And like I got a code in that house that probably did me well. some would also argue I got some bad habits being in the fraternity house.
Maybe.
So we might want to talk about some of that stuff too. But
Yeah.
let's finish on this. So, okay, the kids are going to school, learning from women. Are there more of this thesis of the Industrial Revolution? Is there more that happens there?
Yeah, so now they're raised by women. They're told to behave and act like women. Men are out of the picture either because they're at work, and that's best case scenario. They're at work, but they're still engaged as a father, or they're not even present. Now
is
you
more
have
of that.
Yes.
And it's interesting. We both had Jocko Willink on the show, and Jocko writes children's books.
Right.
And in all of his children's books, the father's not there. And Jocko says that's just the case a lot of times.
It
and
is.
like Jocko is old school. Jocko said, look, men have been going to war for a long time. They've been not there for a long time. And this has actually been a reality for a long time. So
Right.
he might disagree with your premise. I just interviewed my dad for the show recently. And,
Oh, is that right?
and he grew up on a farm. And he said, Brian, even though he grew up on a farm, his dad was never there. Because he got up at 4 a.m. and he came home in the middle of the, very late at night, and he worked all the time. So he said he was actually raised by his mom. Now, he got to see his dad.
Sure.
So maybe there was an influence.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I'm not going to say that's 100% of the time the way that works out, but I think predominantly that's what ends up happening.
Okay, so anything more on this scenario of the Industrial Revolution, or is that kind of how it is? The boys,
that's how
they
it
don't
is.
have releases. They have competitive sports, male
If they
only.
get involved.
If they get involved, which is 20% of the kids at school, or 10.
Maybe. That's a good.
I avoided them until my junior year in high school, where I did wrestling. But other than that, I avoided them. I was a science geek, and these days you can get through high school without competitive sports, right?
You can. I don't know that it's. I wouldn't say that it's not advisable. That's not what I would say. But I think there's something uniquely powerful that can be learned in competitive sports.
Okay, but it didn't do enough for you, obviously, to get where you wanted to be.
No.
And you went into the service, and you went to Iraq on a tour.
Right.
So some would argue that would turn you into a man.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a moment where you become a man. I mean, a lot of cultures throughout history have looked at it, and they've looked at rites of passages and rituals. You even look at your college days with your fraternity, I assume. You get a lot of the rituals. You get, I wouldn't say hazing, maybe hazing.
You got hazed.
You got
and
hazed, right?
Initiated, and
That stuff's important.
It-
And society would say, oh, can't, heaven forbid, we make anybody feel bad, but it straightened you out in a way, right? Because you got
was positive.
You got lined out
Yeah.
by another man who you admired, respected, and looked up to. Because if you didn't, you would have blown him off when he said, "Don't you ever do that again."
Yeah, I would have been thrown out. It was an order.
Right.
The order was enforced if you wanted to be part of the unit.
Right.
And I did.
Right.
So I
toed the line.
learned how to submit. I didn't want to, man. I wasn't good at it because I didn't have to the rest of my life, my previous life of 18 years. But I learned how to, and I learned how to get along among men. And it helped me a lot on Wall Street and in other places in my career later, for sure.
Well, there's value. So this goes back to what Jocko says sometimes, and Aristotle said it also 2,000 years ago, through discipline comes freedom. So you look at that a lot of times, and what a lot of guys will tell me is, and this is a very funny thing to say, it's interesting, a real man doesn't need another man to tell him how to be a man. That's the furthest thing from the truth. There's no other way to learn how to be a man except through other men who have gone before. You can be a male, that just requires anatomy. That's the prerequisite. But being a man is something entirely different. And you have to learn that. Because there's a difference between masculinity and manliness. Masculinity is raw. It's just the raw, masculine testosterone and other hormones coursing through our veins that determine that level of masculinity. Manliness, however, is taking it, refining it, and producing effective outcomes for yourself, for your family, for your community, like you had said earlier, and also for those who can't help themselves. Which there are plenty of people out there who are incapable for whatever reason, and we as men have an obligation to lift those up and to serve them.
Okay. All right. And so when did you start to learn this stuff? And, so you played some competitive sports,
Yes.
but you didn't have a male figure growing up.
Yep.
You served. Mm-hmm. Did that help?
Definitely.
Did you learn some things there?
Yeah, definitely. Let me start with sports.
Okay.
I had one coach in particular. His name is Matt Labrum. In fact, so this was, I'm 38, so this was 20 years ago in high school. And him and I still talk. He's somebody I still admired, respect. He's still coaching, in fact. I had an opportunity to speak with his baseball team last year, or earlier this year. And he was rough on us, man. Like, he was rough. Like, I remember you would look at him, and you did something wrong, and you'd look at him, and you could just see, like, the disgust and disappointment in his eyes. but it wasn't there to belittle you. And that was the difference. And I recognized that even then. I'm like, he doesn't think less of us. He actually thinks more of us. He thinks we're capable of more. So there was never a point in time with him that I thought he doesn't like us or he doesn't want us to win or be successful. It was always about that. But the way that he did it was different than, say, my mother would do it. And so he's rough and hard on us. I remember my boys, earlier, my oldest in particular, he's playing tackle football. He has for the last couple of years. And this season, the first game, he got chewed out by the coach. And I was sitting with my wife on the sideline. I usually coach. I didn't coach this year. And I could see my wife. She's like, she's getting all ruffled up, like mama bear syndrome, right? And I'm like, just relax. He's getting chewed out. He did something wrong. He probably knows he did something wrong. Yes, he did something wrong. Let the coach yell at him. Let him get his butt kicking and his butt chewing, and then let him learn from it. So we got his butt chewing as I was watching. He got his butt chewing. And then a couple of plays later, the coach came over to him, wrapped his arm around him, and started talking to him. And after the game, I asked my son about it, and he says, oh yeah, he was telling me what I needed to do. So he did it in a way that was like, hey, you let down the team, you failed, yell at him. Then what did he do? He built him back up. Well, he was probably cooled off, right? And my son could let the lesson stew a little bit. So I learned that a lot in sports. Sports was really good for me that way. And when I wasn't in sports, I noticed myself getting very aggressive, but not having a constructive outlet for it. I was getting into fights, and I was mouthing off to my teachers, and I was letting this masculinity take control without learning how to harness it in a productive way, which is through, in this case, competitive sports.
Okay. All right. Helpful. All right. Good.
Yes.
Service.
Yes.
Talk about that.
So I joined when I was 17, still in high school, joined the National Guard. Didn't really have any plans on what I wanted to do. I figured the National Guard would be a great way to pay for some schooling, which I planned on after high school. And I was patriotic. I always had this idea that I wanted to serve and wanted to add value and wanted to be a warrior and a contributor to society. The National Guard seemed like a good route because it was, you had your weekend drills that you did, and you had some activities that you had to do during the summer, but you could also be a civilian, right? Civilian soldier in a way. And then in 2003, we got activated and we went to Colorado. We were about a week out when they pulled that Saddam statue down in Baghdad. And I remember watching that in the chow hall a week before we were supposed to go. So they get us together and they say, hey, you know what? Never mind. We're not going. You're going to go to Fort Lewis in Washington State and you're going to train ROTC cadets. So we did that for the summer. And then in 2004. Yeah, it was 2004, Thanksgiving of 2004. My wife and I were newly married. I think we'd been married for about 5 months at the time. We were down in Southern California. I was managing a retail clothing store down there. And my section chief calls me up and he's like, hey, I got some news for you. We've been activated. This was a day before Thanksgiving. So I drive to Southern Utah, which is where her family was and where we're from. So I drive to Southern Utah. She was already there to have dinner. So I drive up there and I'm sitting there eating dinner and my father-in-law says, Ryan, what's wrong with you? Did your unit get activated or something? Just joking. He was joking around. I don't know why he would say that as a joke. What came to his mind to say that? And the only thing I could say at the moment was, actually, yeah, our unit has been activated. My wife didn't even know at the time. The family didn't know. And I left in January of 2005. We did 6 months training stateside and then a year in Iraq. When what you do literally represents the difference between life and death, you start to realize the weight of your consequences. Most people don't have consequences for their choices. I mean, you have a bad day at work, you get reprimanded, even if you lose your job, welfare kicks in, pays it for you. Like, there's no consequence for your decisions. When you're in battle, there's heavy consequences. Somebody dies. And not just somebody, the guy that you're responsible for. And I remember I played softball with a friend of mine. He's actually been on the podcast. His name's Braxton McCoy. And of all things we played softball in the middle of a desert in Ramadi, Iraq. And we were playing softball one day. 2 days later, he gets a mission to go to a glass factory. And part of our unit's mission was recruiting. So responsible for recruiting civilian Iraqis to their security and police force. So he goes on this mission, and one of the Marines and the Marine dog handlers and the dog alerts to an individual, jumps on the individual. That individual blows himself up, and he's packed with a vest full of explosives and ball bearings, shatters his arms, shatters his legs, almost kills him. And it was so weird at the time to think, 2 days later, I was turning a double play. You know, I was playing shortstop, he's playing second base. I was turning a double play with him. And then that happens. And you start to realize this is legitimate. Like, there's consequences for our actions. That's something that's stuck with me forever. And every little action, not just the life and death situations, but how many of us are indifferent to the way that we show up? You know, how many of us are indifferent to the way that we communicate with our wife because she'll always be there? Or the way that we communicate with our kids because we're the boss and they need to do what we tell them to do. And we don't think about how fragile life is. And we don't think about how powerful we are. I mean, we really are. If you think about the words, if you think about our actions, and yes, it's more magnified in a combat environment, but that taught me a lot about what leadership means. It taught me a lot about service. It taught me a lot about the words I choose to use, the actions, the behaviors, the thoughts that I have, and how powerful they are and why they matter. I think there's a lot of people who think that what they say and do doesn't matter. And that's not true. It matters to you and it matters to the people around you. So it was a big learning experience for me.
Made you more of a man?
100%. Because what it means to be a man, first of all, is somebody who takes accountability and responsibility for himself and those he has an obligation for. So when I was sitting in Iraq, and part of what I did while I was there, I was in charge of base defense. I was like a ship supervisor base defense. So we had observation posts all the way around the base. And what those observation posts were looking for is any sort of threat. And as they would recognize and see those threats, it was my job to take that information, go through the data and figure out what the heck was happening, and then figure out a way to respond to that. The way that I communicate and the way that I choose to respond to that situation spells the difference between life and death. I had to take responsibility for myself and for other people I didn't even know. I had to take responsibility for. And that translates perfectly into running a business, leading a family, coaching a sports team, being involved in your community, any other capacity in which we serve.
And I guess a history of fighting in wars, you know, I guess been in humanity for thousands of years. So
ever since we've,
yeah.
And who goes out to battle, right? The men. Traditionally, the men.
Right.
The men go out to battle because physically they're stronger, they're more likely to take risks. In a lot of ways, I think most cultures believe that the women are a more valuable asset. We've got to protect the women. That's very pragmatic. That's kind of gone away, but I think that's true.
What do you think about women in service and women in leadership and women in corporate?
So
start with service.
Yes. This is where it tends to get a little controversial for me. When I was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is where I did my basic training, we were one of the first units to be a co-ed training unit. And in my experience and what I saw is that when you have multiple standards, the lower standard is the one that's enforced and upheld.
Explain multiple standards.
Well, so take the physical fitness training requirements for the military. Well, the standard for women is lower. They can run slower, do less push-ups, do less sit-ups. The standard, naturally, that makes sense. Men are generally stronger. So there's two standards. So if there's no man left behind and I will never leave a fallen comrade, well, whose standard do we go off of? Well, we can't leave the women behind, so that's an inferior standard. So people will hear me say that and think, oh, well, that's sexist. You think less of women. No, it's the facts. You take the average man and you take the average woman. The average man is bigger, stronger, faster, etc. That's the way it is, whether you like it or not. So what I saw a reduced standard because of that. Now, are there women who are capable of hanging with the men? Absolutely. And if we're going to go by that standard, then it should be a uniform standard. And the Army is working to unify, and the military in general, to unify the standard. But what happens when you try to unify or merge the standards? Does the lower standard come up, or does this one come down? Well, this one comes down. The higher standard comes down.
Okay. So physically, that's true. But do women bring other assets to the table?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Such as?
They do. I think women can be decisive. Well, let me say it this way. Masculinity is not all man, and femininity is not all woman, right? There are varying degrees of that, right? So we all at times can exhibit what we would traditionally believe is masculine qualities and characteristics: strength, decisiveness, fortitude, resiliency, rational, thinking, an ability to take higher levels of risk. That's not exclusive to men. It's just what we would consider a masculine characteristic. So women are fully capable of exhibiting that. And that's why the women that you see in the military who succeed and thrive in the military are generally more masculine.
Same in, say, mixed martial arts?
Or in the corporate world.
Okay.
Of course they're going to be. They have to be.
Right.
They have to be highly competitive. They have to be decisive. They have to be willing to take risks. They have to be firm, strong, mentally, physically, emotionally. So women like that are going to be more masculine. And so I have no problem. I think that's great. But I have a problem when the standard changes in order to facilitate not just women, but anybody. It's not an organization's responsibility to accommodate other individuals. If an individual, whether it's a woman or whoever it may be, wants to engage in an organization or environment, it's their responsibility to assimilate to that organization. You want to be here? Great. Here's the standard. Can you meet it? Yes or no? You can meet it? Great. Welcome. No, you're not welcome. That's what I think it should be.
What about women having less ego, being able to form a coalition better, being able to make decisions, sometime more logically because maybe egos aren't involved? One of my mentors, and we'll definitely talk about him, Dan Pena, who was pretty masculine, pretty alpha.
Yeah, he is.
And we'll definitely talk about him. But he says that when he brings people to the castle, the women get it quicker because they're able to move forward without their egos getting in the way. And they're able to execute on things because they follow by the numbers and they don't let that get in.
I think that's actually very true of not only that, but another area, hunting, believe it or not, shooting, just marksmanship in general. I know, for example, for me, when I shoot, I put a lot of pressure on myself to perform. Women don't have that same level of pressure. They don't apply it to themselves because they're out just to do it. And that added level of pressure and stress causes some variance in the way that you shoot, whether it's a bow or a rifle. But women tend to do better because they don't have that added level of stress.
Your wife's a better marksman than you.
Absolutely.
You're very honest about that on your Instagram.
You know what's funny about it? So I only started hunting 2 years ago. She's been hunting with her dad for 20 plus years. And I love my wife. It's really funny, actually. So I went on a couple hunts, and then last year I went on a hunt and missed a really great shot on a buck. I just dropped the ball. I just couldn't make it. And I was kind of reminiscing. I was back from the hunt and I was talking with her and I said, it's just really frustrating. I wish I could go back and just like redo that, because here's what I would do. Do you know what I mean? That's what I said to her. And she's like, no, I don't know what you mean. I've never missed any of the animals I've ever shot at. And it's true. She's 100%. And that might be because she doesn't add that added level of stress and anxiety and pressure. She's there to do her thing, and that's it. So I'm not, the point that I'm making is that I'm not saying that the roles that men have traditionally filled should be filled exclusively by men. There's a set of characteristics that makes an individual successful in certain capacities. And whether those roles and responsibilities can be filled by men or women, that's great, as long as it can be completed to the standard that's set. Okay. I do not like to see inferior standards because it puts people at risk.
And that's what's happening in the military.
And other organizations, if and that goes for men or women. If there's an inferior male soldier, he's got to go because he's putting people at risk. Same thing in the work environment. If there's somebody in the team, whether it's a man or woman who's not performing, they got to go. Give them all the chances and all the training and all the tools available to catch up but we're not slowing down, and we're definitely not turning around to carry your weight. So let's go, catch up, or we got to let you go out into the world.
Okay. And that applies to corporates as well.
Oh, 100%.
And anywhere else.
Yes, I think so.
What, so all right. So, but this, how far into your marriage were you when you went on the service? Was that a few years in? Had you,
When I went to Iraq,
Yeah.
We were married for 6 months at the time.
okay. All right.
Yeah.
So you still came back from that and you still separated. So
Yes.
that wasn't enough to teach you enough how to be a man.
No.
Yet. So
No,
that's
in
interesting. The sports didn't do it. The service didn't do it. You had to go on your own journey.
I think it laid the foundation.
Okay. Fair enough.
I mean, you get the knowledge, but knowledge is, you have a book, for example, your stack of books over here. It's like, that's a great stack of books. And even if you read it, still a great stack of books. It doesn't really mean anything until you apply it. So I learned a lot of this. I observed a lot of this, but I felt like there was a bridge between what I knew and what I did. So when I started Order of Man in 2015, my goal has always been, and I've told the guys, to bridge the gap between what we know and what we do. And that gap, I call that the integrity gap. And we all have it. Some small integrity gap. Some have a large integrity gap. I have an integrity gap. You have an integrity gap. I'm constantly trying to fill it. So are you. I know that of you. Right? And most men who listen to this, and most women who listen to both of us are trying to do that.
Live up to what they know they should do.
Right.
Make
Because
those decisions. Be that person they know they should be.
Because if all it was knowledge, we'd all be independently wealthy. We'd all have chiseled six-pack abs. We'd be the greatest father, husband, or wife, or whoever we were trying to become, and we would succeed and thrive in every single area of life because we're not at a lack of information. You've got your tablet in front of you. You can access whatever you want on a moment's notice. It's not the information. It's the application of that information. And whoever can apply it the fastest, quickest, and most efficiently will win.
And so you started Order of Man. And so you went on your own journey, and then you found yourself going into this masculinity more and going into, maybe I need to connect with being a man.
Yes.
And again, I said this is a book, I'm just roughly using that term, masculinity. It's not a self-help book. So there's Tony Robbins over here, which is I'm going to show everybody how to become better.
Right.
And you're like, I'm going to focus on connecting with my manhood and who I am as a man.
Right.
Maybe can you explain why that became so evident to you as important? And then why?
That's what I wanted.
That's what you wanted. Or
Personally.
Okay.
I wanted to solve my own problems.
But Ryan's problems, or also Ryan's problems as a man?
As a man.
Okay, that
Because
must have kept coming up.
I thought they were problems, and I believe that they are problems as a man, not just an individual.
Because you weren't properly raised as a man, so you're raising yourself as a man.
I didn't feel like I was.
Okay, all right.
I was raised to be a good human being.
Right.
My mom did a wonderful job. She's a loving woman. I never had to worry about food on the table or a roof over my head or paying for sports or going on field trips. I never had to worry about any of that. Never had to worry about, am I loved or does somebody care about me? Never. It was never a thing of mine. I mean, we weren't broke. Looking back on it now, I think we were not as well off as I thought we were. She didn't lead on to a whole lot of that. But, I think about what life would have been like had I had a father. And I think what it comes down to is a level of confidence. I think I would have had a lot more confidence about who I was if I would have had a father in my life. Now, some people say, do you wish you had a father in my life? I would say no, because I don't think I'd be the same man that I am today if I didn't have that. I don't think I would have gone on a quest to solve my own problems as a man, which in turn has literally helped millions of people across the planet. Right. Men become the men they're capable of becoming.
Okay, and so what are some of the things you learned and what are some of the things that you teach to men?
Yeah, so, man, where do we start with what I've learned about being a man? Well, first of all, let me say it this way. A man's job is to be a protector, provider, and a presider. I think everybody generally and universally agrees with the protector part. That's not one people push back on a lot.
Physically protecting?
Yes.
Okay. Kids,
even when
people.
I'm walking around in a new environment with my wife, it's my job to make sure we get from point A to point B safely. It's not her job. And when shit hits the fan, nobody's going to look to the woman about it. Who are they going to look to? The man. And am I going to be the kind of guy that cowers in the corner and runs from that adversity because I'm scared? Or am I going to be the guy who maybe is scared but has trained himself and made himself capable of protecting himself and others. That's the kind of guy I want to be. Those are the kind of men that I aspire to be like. That's why I got into martial arts. Now, jiu-jitsu is not the end-all, save-all. I'm not saying that. But it's certainly a step in the right direction. It's certainly moving away from being dependent to being self-reliant.
What percentage of men do you think are ready to protect right now?
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.